Hello everyone. This week I had the opportunity to play a couple more games of Jugular, which is a Roman gladiatorial game from Studiotomahawk, who are the creators of other excellent war games such as Saga, Muskets and Tomahawks, and Congo more recently. Jugular's been out for several years now, and I did play a few games of it when it first came out. To be honest, I wasn't too taken with it at first, but more recently I was drawn back to it by the figures themselves that you can purchase from Gripping Beast to complement the game. So I really came back to it just from the point of view of painting up the figures, and then found that I actually quite enjoyed the game as well. So I thought while I still had the figures out on the table and the game out, I'd do a short video just explaining the mechanics of the game. Right, so it's played on a playing mat. I've purchased this sort of vinyl kind of mat that you can purchase as an accessory. If you buy the rulebook does come with a kind of paper mat that unfolds. I seem to have lost that now, but I've got this much better replacement. That is one of the things that is unattractive about the game, really, that when you buy the rulebook, unlike Congo, which comes with movement markers, tokens, all that kind of thing, with Jugular you get the rulebook and very little else. The mat itself is, I can't remember how much, but it is quite expensive. Obviously you have to buy the figures, which you would do with any set of rules, but you also have to buy packs of cards, because it's a card driven game, so you need to buy one of these for each player, and again, more recently with Congo, the rules actually come with the packs of cards that you need, so with Jugular, it's a game for up to 4 players, so you could conceivably require 4 packs of cards if your opponent doesn't possess the rules in his own pack of cards himself. But as I say, more recently, as I've got back into the game, I've realised that it's a really interesting game mechanic. So it is actually a good game in its own right, but it's a very nice, easy pick up and play game that you can carry around to clubs and other friends' houses and so on. Doesn't take a massive number of figures. You only need 4 figures per player to play the game. So it's very portable, and as I say, the mechanics of the game, actually it produces a really interesting, challenging game. Right, so what I want to do first of all then is show you the card pack. So for each pack of cards you get 36 cards in here. The first 12 of them are the cards that show the details of the various gladiatorial types. I think they call them armaturas, that you can play with in the game. So I want to just bring the camera a little bit closer and show you each of these in turn. Right, so you excuse me, you have Sagittarius. I have one version of Sagittarius. Also the figures themselves, you can either buy them individually or in box sets. If you buy the box sets, they come with a lot of variants for heads and weapons and so on, so you can configure your own variants of various gladiatorial types, but I've only got one of the Sagittarius. Now for each armatura, The card has a number of different details on it. The green silhouette indicates that it's an agile gladiator. The number in the top right hand corner is the number of movement points that the figure has, and then you have attack and defence values against both the green agile type of gladiator and the orange type of gladiator, which is termed as being deadly. So you have effectively a sort of heavy and a light variant of different types of gladiator. And you also have down the bottom here various traits. Some gladiators have no traits, in which case it says none, but in the case of Sagittarius, he has a range value, which obviously is representative of the fact that he has a missile weapon, so he can project his forward zone forward 5 squares, so that he can hit any figure that's within that range limit. And the bow is another trait, which is a handicap in a way, because it's indicating that he can't shoot at anything that's in the squares immediately in front of him. So every single figure has a different card with different values on it. On the flip side, there's also revised statistics if the figure becomes wounded. So that's Sagittarius. We'll run through all of these, may as well. You have a gladiator known as Scissor, which is this figure here. Scissor is kind of the natural counterpart to the Retiarius, and he has a trait of Stoic, which is kind of indicative of the fact that he can't be hindered by a net or a lasso or anything like that. His cutting weapon allows him to cut straight through it. You have Laciarius, who is a figure who can be armed either with a lasso or a whip. Hoplomachus, who is a very kind of stylised type of gladiator. It's meant to represent an ancient Greek hoplite, only with a much smaller shield. And I have two figures to represent Hoplomachus. Those two there. So you can see what I mean again about being able to vary the figures. If you buy the box sets, you can put different shields on them, give them different headgear and so on. This one is Veles, who is a sort of light troop, meant to represent the kind of velites type troops in the Roman army. So again, I have two variants of him, one with the wolf's head and another just bareheaded. Provocateur, which is this guy here. Thrax, who is supposedly symbolic of ancient sort of Thracian fighters. Secutor, who again I have two variants of. In this case I just changed the helmet, I didn't change anything else about him. Murmillo, who was a classic gladiator in the arena, and again I have two variants of him. Dimacharius, who is armed with a weapon in each hand. Creepularius, who is extremely heavily armoured, so he has this characteristic called massive. Makes him very powerful if he's striking anything directly in front of him, but blind to attacks from the side and the rear, really, so he has a handicap if he's attacked from the side or the rear. And finally, the classic Gladiator that we're all familiar with from Hollywood movies and so on, the Retiarius, who is armed with a trident and a net. Okay, now the game is played out on an 8-sided grid, so you could almost play the game on a classic draft or checkerboard or chessboard. The figures themselves, let's take Creepularius, put him there. As I said earlier, they each have a range that they can move, which is the figure indicated in the front, or a number of movement points that they can spend, rather. As I said, the Creepularius is a very heavily armoured gladiator. He can't move very much at all. If you compare him to the valets, who is this guy here? He has a movement of 8, so far more agility. So let's stick with the valets, and I can probably show you more clearly what I'm talking about with him. You move the figure around on the square by expending movement points. So if he's facing that way, he has, 8 squares around him. The 3 front squares are deemed to be his front zone. He has 2 flanks, a rear and a back. Now, to move straight forward into his the square immediately in front of him only costs 1 point. To move to any of the other squares costs him 2 points. If he were to change the direction of his facing and not move, that would cost him 1 point. If he were to change the direction of his facing and then move, it wouldn't cost him a point for changing direction. So in other words, he's gone from like that to like that and only spent 1 point, whereas if he had not changed his facing, to do that would have cost him 2 points. Now the only other expenditure of points comes, let's put Creepularius back on the board. If this figure here wanted to move and he were in the one of the 3 squares facing an opponent, he would have to spend an additional point to leave that square. So for instance, if he wanted to go to there, normally a move straight ahead would cost 1 point. Because he's leaving one of those 3 squares there, he has to spend an additional point, so that now costs 2 points to do that. If he then turned to face that gladiator, that would cost another point, so he spent 3 points because he has moved, he's changed direction, but he hasn't moved. And finally, the square directly in front of a gladiator is deemed to be the danger zone, so it's a danger to the opponent. So if those 2 figures are standing off like that, the only option this gladiator has, if he wants to get out of the danger zone, is to reverse backwards. He can't make a move like that, for instance. So that would cost him an additional point, so it would cost him 2 points to move backwards and an additional 1 to move out of that front zone, so that would cost him 3 points. If he were facing that way, he can't do that. He has to turn and then reverse. And they are basically all the rules to do with movement. Right, on to all the various ways and the rest of the cards in the pack. Okay, so I've said that there are 36 cards in the pack. I've now shown you the 12 Gladiator cards. So you pick 4 figures, pick the appropriate 4 cards, and put the other 8 cards of those back in the pack because you're not going to use them for that game. Then after that you have a further 24 cards. 12 of them are known as the Jugular cards, and they are the cards that have this sort of brownish lettering here. And you have 12 cards, the Prima Jugular cards, that have these reddish letterings here. Initially you are going to be playing just with these 12 cards here. So these are shuffled and played face down, so they are the deck that you are drawing cards from. And at the start of the game you draw 4 cards. Now every card has 7 different ways in which it can be played, and this is where the complexity of the game really kicks in, and where you have to think very strategically to play the game. If we take this card at the top here, which is the title Virtus, what it's telling you is that you can play this card in a number of ways. It's quite a valuable card. This one is probably the highest valued card in the Jugular pack. It's telling you that you can move, which is indicated by the sandal, and you can move 4 figures. So that is your entire ludus of gladiators. All 4 figures can move if you play it for movement. You can increase your popularity with the crowd. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment, but you can increase your popularity by 3 points if you play it for that. You can initiate combat with 3 of your gladiators, or 3 times. The restriction on that being that you could initiate the same gladiator to fight against the same opponent 3 times, but in any turn you are only allowed to inflict 1 wound on an opponent. So if you inflict a wound on an enemy gladiator, you can't inflict another wound in the same turn. That's in order to keep the combat going and appeal to the crowd. And this item here indicates that you can draw an additional 4 cards from the deck. And again, you're limited at the start of the game to only being able to hold 5 cards, but as your popularity with the crowd increases, your entitlement to hold a greater number of cards increases. So that's 4 ways you can play the card down here. You can also play it by playing the attribute on the card, the characteristic of the card. So this particular one says if you do not have the highest vox populi, you can reduce the vox populi of an opponent by 2, and then if your vox populi is 5 or less, you can play another card. So in other words, you can reduce the popularity of one of your opponents with the crowd and get to play another card if you aren't particularly popular yourself. There is a dice value to the card because you can play it as a dice throw, and again I'll get onto that in a moment. And finally, this one here, this star in the corner here, is indicative of the fact that you can play this card in order to select from the Prima Jugular stack of cards a card with a value of either 1, 2 or 3 stars. You can only pick 1 card, so you can't pick one that's valued at 2 and one that's valued at 1 to make a total of 3, but it allows you to pick any Prima Jugular card. So let's show you those next. So the Prima Jugular cards, you don't shuffle, you don't have them face down. As you can see from that last ability, you're allowed to select and see what you can select. so you can make a choice. So each card has a star rating of either 1, 2 or 3, which you can see up in the top left hand corners here. Other than that, they are all very similar to the Jugular cards, only much more valuable. They're far more effective to play with. So once you have selected this card, it goes into your hand, and then after that, when you've played it, it goes into your discard pile so that it's in play. So the more Prima Jugular cards you can get into play, the more effective your play is going to be. But as I say, other than that, it has all the same 7 variants of the way in which you can play the card. Right, so next I'll just tell you a little bit more about the Vox Populi. Okay, so each player has in front of him a table showing his current Vox Populi. So you have to put a token down at the beginning of the game in the box that says 0. And as I said earlier, if you play a card for its Vox Populi effect, so in this case the Vox Populi, if you played the card to increase your Vox Populi, it would go up by 1. So if I played that card to increase my Vox Populi, I'd just simply move the token up 1. But as you progress along this scale here, you notice these 2 red and blue characteristics increase. The red is the additional bonus you get to an attack, and the blue is the number of cards that you can hold in your hand at any one time. So, for instance, if I was playing this character here, the Thrakes, and I had a Vox Populi, let's say, of 4, if I wanted to strike a blow against this opponent here, who is Scissor, I could hit him in any of those 3 squares that are in front of me. So that is my front zone. So let's say he's directly in front of me. I would have to play a card that showed a value against the combat skill there. So this would allow me to activate 1 combat, so that would be sufficient to do this. I would then have to calculate, I would then have to draw from my hand another card with a dice value on it, or draw the top card off of the deck blind. So say for instance I had this card in my hand, and it's got a dice value of 4 on it. I would place that face down, and my opponent would do the same, either draw a card from his hand or draw one blind from the deck, from the top of the deck. You then reveal your dice values, and to that you add a number of additions. The attacker adds the value of his Vox Populi, so he would go from 4 to 5. He would also increase the value of his attack if, say, he were attacking from the side or from the rear. He would increase by 1 or 2. And in fact from the back, from the very back, he would increase by 3. So it would be 2 if he were attacking there, but 3 there. You total that up, see what you get. The opponent is the defender, so he then counts his dice value, whatever that was, and adds onto that any other factors that might influence him. He doesn't add the Vox Populi figure, this is only for attack, but he would increase or decrease rather, say if he had another enemy opponent threatening him, so if he was in the front zone of another opponent, the attacker would have had to have done the same. If this was on the opposite side, he would have had to reduce by 1. and then you work out by how much the attacker or the defender has won. If the defender wins, has a higher value, he puts his Vox Populi up. If the attacker wins, he pushes the figure back if he has a greater value. If it's double the defence value, he wounds him, so you put a wound token on that gladiator and you turn his card over to indicate that all his various statistics have now been reduced. If it's 4 times the figure, he kills him outright. And as I said earlier, having wounded him, if that figure there had been a 2, he's allowed to advance into the vacated square, but he couldn't attack him again because he's already wounded him once, so there wouldn't be any point. Other considerations are if you are up against the back of the arena or you have another player directly behind you. If you can't go back, then you receive a wound instead. So in other words, then if you get a double so that he is pushed back and wounded, he gets another wound for being unable to go into that square, so he's got 2 wounds and he's dead. And the game ends when one player or the other has scored either, the simplest way of looking at it is when he's scored 4 points, and you get a point for a wound and 2 points for a fatality. So if he kills two of the opponent's figures, he's won. If he kills 1 and wounds 2, he's won. And that's the simplest way to look at it. And that really is the essence of the game. So it's pretty straightforward, but it rapidly becomes very convoluted because of the number of routes that you can choose to go down the path of victory. You can either concentrate on putting your popularity up, or you can concentrate on getting more of these prima jugular cards into your hand. There are a number of these cards that allow you to sort through your deck and remove all the low value cards. So in other words, if you're going to be drawing cards at random for their dice value, you can be more confident that you're going to draw a high value. There's lots of ways of scoring victories, and on top of that you have all the various traits that influence the way you're going to play the particular figure. So it's a very complex, very kind of strategic type of game. It gets you thinking a lot, and it's great fun, so I can highly recommend it. Right, so I thought I'd just take the opportunity of the fact that I had the figures out to show you that. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.